Good evening, everybody. Welcome to, this Chatham House members event on winners and losers in the leaderless world. My name is Bernice Lee. I'm the Research Director for Energy, Environment and Resource Governance at Chatham House here. We're very happy today to have Ian Bremmer, who is the president and co-founder of the Eurasia Group, to talk to us about his new book, Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. As you all know, nowadays we suffer from huge leadership vacuums almost everywhere we look. And on issues that I work on especially, which is energy, environment, and climate change, I cannot wait to hear what Ian has to say about the new world order that is awaiting us when no one, as he argues in his book, is now able to drive any global agenda efficiently and effectively anymore on their own. Ian probably doesn't need a lot of introduction. He, as I said, is the president of the Eurasia Group. He founded it in 1998. He created the Wall Street's first political risk index and authored many different books, including this particular one, which talks about the risks and opportunities in a world without global leaders. This meeting today is held under the Chatham House rule. I was complaining earlier that I hadn't had enough sleep. This meeting today is on the record, and it's being live streamed. The opposite. And there are questions that are coming in from our online audience. Some already have arrived, and we may have more later on today. But without further ado, Ian, please, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you. Shall I stand? Is that better?
It's up to you.
It's more energetic if I stand, I think, right? You don't have to look at my socks the entire time. I never know about these things. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me back to your august and venerable institution. It's been a couple of years, but it's a pleasure. It's a privilege. We had a good time here last time. It was a smaller crowd, a smaller room. These issues are becoming more important. I was also told as I walked in that frequently the speeches are kind of canned and not very interesting, and the Q&A is where the excitement is. I don't can my speeches, really. I certainly don't write them down in advance. So if it's bad, it's bad in an improvisational way. And so I hope you find it worthwhile. I will talk a little bit about the book and the concept. I'll be a little wonky because I understand and appreciate and identify with the crowd, and then hopefully the Q&A will be lively, and then we can have more outside over drinks, because I'm not going anywhere particularly. It's been a long day, but I'm done now. So this is fun. This is entre nous and everyone you live tweet to. Having just come from the United States, as I'm sure most of you are aware, there has been a large debate about whether or not the United States is in decline. It is not surprising that this is the most important debate on foreign policy going in on the United States, because it is a narcissistic debate. We are good at that. It is about us. Everything depends on whether or not we are in decline. Let me first start by saying I find it an irrelevant debate. And it's an irrelevant debate, even though I have a view on it. It's an irrelevant debate because whether or not you think the United States is in decline, whether you are Luce or Brzezinski or Kagan or any of the others, whether or not you believe that, the United States is not going to bail out Europe. Right? Geithner, Secretary of Treasury, is going to come over frequently. He's not writing checks. That's clear. Whatever your view on whether or not the U.S. is in decline, the U.S. is not going to send troops back to Iraq, not going to expand the surge in Afghanistan. There's no one remotely electable on the Republican or Democratic side that would do that thing. They're not going to take the lead on climate change globally. They're not going to remove Assad from power. And let me say somewhat more controversially, they're not going to bomb Iran, which is one of the reasons why everyone keeps asking if Israel is going to do it. My answer to that is also no, though it's with less certainty, but the United States is not. So if whether or not the U.S. is in decline is not driving the answer to any of these pressing questions, then what's the question we should be asking? And the question I think we should be asking is, what's the nature of the world order? If not the U.S., who? If nobody, then what? And nobody is a reasonable answer. You know, Americans love to say that things are intolerable when things are not intolerable, right? When the North Koreans said they were going to test a nuclear weapon, we said that we would be very angry. It would be intolerable if they did. They tested one, we got angry. They tested a second one, we got angry. We've done precisely nothing to change that reality. When Obama was going to become president, he said that keeping Guantanamo open would be intolerable. Turns out he could tolerate it. Romney has now said that on the first day when he becomes president, he will declare China a currency manipulator. Were he to become president, which is plausible, I can assure every single one of you in this room he will do no such thing. It is tolerable. And by the way, the Israelis say that it is an existential threat to them if the Iranians develop nuclear capacity. I assert that it is a very bad thing. It is a dangerous thing. It is a destabilizing thing. It is an existential threat to a country with 200-ish nuclear weapons. That's farcical. Why don't we say that? Well, I know why we don't say it. But the point is, why don't we at least think it? We should think it. And as a consequence, it should affect the way we think about policy. Now, when I talk about the G0, what I'm really talking about is creative destruction in the geopolitical order. We have creative destruction in the business environment all the time. You used to have independent bookstores in lovely cities across the developed world. Then Barnes & Noble and Borders and other places came along, Waterstones and the rest, and those independent bookstores adapted or they died. And then Amazon came along and the big chains adapted or they died. It's creative destruction and it causes pain, but it also leads to new productivity and efficiency and all of that. Creative destruction rarely happens in the geopolitical environment. I would argue the last time it happened in earnest was at the end of World War II. It is happening now. After World War II, the United States created the order that we have experienced for over half a century. It's American institutions, American values, the American political and economic system, American allies, American capital, right? Bretton Woods Accord on currency, UN Security Council, General Assembly, IMF, World Bank. All of these equally august and venerable institutions sound global. The World Bank sounds global. The World Series sounds global. Right? We have a Canadian team. That should be sufficient. That's my perspective. But of course, the World Bank also, we've got an American president. We let some other folks in terms of voting rights and the rest, and we listen to them, but then we do what we want to do. That's the World Bank, right? That's the American-led World Bank. I'm not trying to mock this. I'm trying to say that the reality of the world order post-World War II was globalization that didn't just happen mechanistically. It happened because the United States drove it. But over the last 30 years, the underlying balance of power, of course, shifted away from the US and its allies towards China, towards the developing world, away from debtor states towards creditor states. Well, it doesn't take a genius to understand that when you have architecture and values and standards and systems that are created by a world order that no longer exists in reality, that at some point that is going to break. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was an insufficient shock to bring that break to the fore, and 9/11 was insufficient, but the 2008 financial crisis was sufficient. And that's when, of course, we talked about the creation of the G20, a great idea, the world's 20 largest economies all getting together, developed and developing harmoniously and saying, we will work on providing collective leadership to determine outcomes that will provide ultimately public goods so that we can run our world in a more effective, efficient, and humane way. It's a great concept. I am in favor of it as a concept. I love the idea of a Doha round on trade. I love the concept of a global accord on climate. I want a pony for Christmas. I want all of these things. None of them are going to happen. right? So we have the aspirational G20. I was at Davos last year, and I bring up the fact with Ilse Kong, who at that point was the South Korean Sherpa, the presidential envoy for the G20, and we get into a fight. And he says, Ian, what do you want? The G20 isn't good enough for you? What do you want? You want more countries? You want the G192? What do you want? You want less? You want the G7, G8? And I was like, it's not what I want. What I want is irrelevant. It's what we have. That's all. So what do we think about that? If I'm right, if we're in a G0 environment now, briefly, what are some implications of that? First implication is that a lot more instability, a lot more volatility, a lot more risk. As we think about what that means for who does well, it's no longer let's go and invest in emerging markets that are all about growth. You're concerned more about resilience. You're concerned more about safety. So the combination of resilience and growth together becomes much more important. In some ways, that benefits the Europeans. It certainly benefits the United States. In some ways, it benefits Japan. It is a problem for countries like China and Russia that have a lot of growth but don't have resilience. And I certainly want to talk about China a lot with you guys in this conversation. If in the old US-led world order, the way to win was to align yourself with US-led globalization, in this new G0 order, you want to adapt. You want to be able to be flexible because lots of different countries will have different standards, will have different preferences, different modes of integration. You want to be what I call a pivot state. Mexico doesn't pivot, right? Trade, remittances to Mexicans abroad, from Mexicans abroad, tourism, drugs. Mexico is all about the United States. Canada can pivot. I was with the Canadian Foreign Minister a few months ago, John Baird, and his first comment to me was how proud he was as Foreign Minister that his first trip abroad was to Beijing and not to Washington. Why? Well, because the United States and Europe are in inexorable decline. His words, not my words. Now, I don't care if you agree with that. I don't care if I agree with that. It's not the point. The point is that if Obama decides that he is not going to build a Keystone XL pipeline up to Canada for exploitation and transport of the Canadian oil sands, I know 1.3 billion Chinese that would love to have that bridge, right? We know that British Columbia started exporting more timber to China and the United States as of a year ago. As climate change continues, I can think of a northern shipping route that's going to bring Canada in closer contact with lots of countries around the world. That is a much better position to be in, right? Ukraine doesn't pivot. They'd like to pivot. They'd like to have a European customs union. They don't. They're stuck to Russia. Turkey pivots well, especially now that they've jettisoned the Israelis. Taiwan doesn't pivot, even though the Taiwanese president, last time I saw him, was all in favor of Trans-Pacific Partnership, new trade agreements with Singapore and Australia and New Zealand. They can't pivot. Their business and their economy is only in China and expanding every day. Indonesia, in my view, pivots very well. Kazakhstan pivots well. Mongolia does not. So this is one broad point I would mention, just a different way to think about how we perceive some of the winners and losers in this environment. The United States, in my view, is not particularly a loser in this environment. I mean, sure, you would prefer the world order where the US was dominant. But given that creative destruction was going to happen, number one, you want it to happen earlier rather than later. You'd much rather the 2008 financial crisis happen then than in 2018. Because in 2018, the underlying balance of power will be much further away from the US and allies. And as a consequence of that, the ability of the US and other like-minded states to create new architecture and new structure is much more challenged. The problem that the United States has is the safe haven curse. It's like the Dutch disease, but it doesn't involve the resources. And still, it involves a whole bunch of countries and investors that think that the US is very important as safe haven in the G0, and so as a consequence, the US is not pressed to make the kind of long-term decisions they desperately need to really be sustainable and strong in 10 and 20 and 30 years on deficit reduction, and perhaps more importantly, on education and the rest. That is a challenge I see for the United States. In the near term, the US looks perfectly good in a G0 environment. I do not believe that the G0 is sustainable. Nature abhors a vacuum. Geopolitics abhors a vacuum as well. What comes next? I'll give you what I think comes next, but I'm not certain about it. I don't feel certain about it. It'd be a lot of hubris for me to say that I felt certain about it. But I do think there are two important questions to answer if you want to know what comes next. The first question is, what is the disposition of the world's two most important economies towards each other, the United States and China? Are they going to be more harmonious than competitive or not? And the second question is, how much do other countries matter as actors globally? Do they matter a lot or do they matter a little? And that's really in relative terms, right? If you can answer both of those questions, I think you have a pretty good sense of what is likely to come from the G0. And to make a key point in how much there's a transition here, I believe that with the G0, we see the end of US-led global institutions. Going forward, we will either have US-led institutions that aren't global, global institutions that aren't US-led, or neither. And I would argue that we have not yet decided what we want to do on this stuff, right? In trade with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we are starting to say we would like US-led organizations that aren't global. We're starting to. We're saying Doha's dead. Let's find an organization that brings Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Australia, like-minded countries together. It'll be a smaller grouping, but it'll be a more meaningful grouping, and that's how we'll do trade architecture. It's nascent, not signed yet. There are a lot of problems. Not everyone buys in. But that's an idea. The U.S. is not doing that on the World Bank. They're not doing that in the IMF. They're not doing that at the G20. They're not doing that with the Europeans on trade. There are many places they're not doing it. It's interesting. Interesting. So to get back to those two questions, my preliminary answers, U.S.-China heading in a more negative direction. And I'd make a fairly strong bet on that. It's kind of interesting, you know, in the election period in the United States, I'm sure people have questions about this. Romney was recently asked about America's geopolitical condition. He said, you know, that the number one geopolitical foe to the United States is Russia, which was only 30 years out of date. Not bad. And then Obama gets a question, same question. He says the number one geopolitical foe for the United States is Al-Qaeda, which is only a few years out of date. It's not bad. I happen to think that China is the Voldemort of countries, right? It is the geopolitical foe whose name must not be spoken. You don't mention China, because that's only going to make matters worse, right? But of course, the reality is, I mean, Obama doesn't have doctrines. He doesn't do doctrines, because doctrines implies long-term strategic direction, which limits flexibility. He hates that on foreign policy, doesn't want to do it. To the extent that he has a doctrine, that doctrine is economic statecraft and the pivot to Asia, both of which are completely and inexorably focused on China, right? Ask Hillary Clinton about this issue. What is the pivot to Asia all about? She said, we welcome the peaceful rise of China as long as they behave the way we want them to. And do you expect them to behave that way? Well, not really. Well, what happens if they don't behave that way? Well, then it's a hedge. What do you mean by hedge? Silence. But of course, the Japanese know what we mean by hedge. They think we mean containment. More importantly, the Chinese are not stupid. The Chinese understand this too. On security in the East and South China Sea, on cyber, on indigenous innovation, clearly, to the extent that the U.S. is expending strategic brain power and cash and political coin, it is because they are concerned about the potential of China rising as the United States' largest geopolitical foe. Now, certainly, if I want to be metaphysical, I could say the biggest geopolitical foe to the United States is itself, but that's kind of boring, and we don't want to go there, and this is an international affairs thing, so let's not do that. But certainly China. So I think that U.S.-China are heading in a much more negative direction. We can unpack why that is going forward. I also believe that other countries are going to play a very significant role on the global stage. In part, I believe that because some of these countries are really coming into their own. Certainly India long-term vis China, yes. Certainly Turkey in the region and beyond, yes. Certainly Brazil in the region and beyond, yes. And I would even make that argument for Europe, but I'd make it for Europe in part because the United States and China will be very limited in what they're willing to do. The United States for reasons having a lot to do with the nature of the US constituency. Increasingly large numbers of Americans do not believe they benefit from US-led globalization. Increasingly large numbers of Americans do not believe the US should be the global policeman or the global lender of last resort. Why should we spend money in Afghanistan? Why should we put our troops over there when we're not fixing New Orleans after Katrina? Why should we do that? That's not a winner in the United States. No Republican or Democrat has a very good answer to that, and that's not going to change in the near term unless it just becomes exacerbated. I believe that. Furthermore, if you think that's an issue in the US, that is a huge issue in China, where overwhelmingly the focus is ensuring the political viability and sustainability of that regime. That doesn't get easier over time. That gets harder over time. No one is kicking a bigger can longer down the road than the Chinese, not the Americans, not the Europeans, not the Japanese, the Chinese, because they must fundamentally restructure their economic and political system to keep the darn thing going. They know this. They have identified the problem. Well, it doesn't mean they can implement on it. It's a big uncertainty. And so for those reasons, I believe other countries will matter a lot. Now, if I'm right, and if coming out of the G0 we have an environment where the US and China are heading for more confrontation and other countries are going to matter a lot, what does that mean? That means we will not have a reversion to global leadership. That means we will end up in a world of regions. But those regions do not imply globalizations writ small, because the regions run completely differently from one another. As a region, Europe, as you know, runs comparatively well. I mean, again, comparatively, when you think about the importance of institutions in Europe and rule of law, that integration is relatively voluntary, that it is largely transparent, that it is on the basis of largely common economic and political values. Now go to Eurasia, just a little bit to the east, and what does integration look like? It is much more coercive. It is much more informal, on the basis of relations between heads of state and oligarchs and security services. It's much more about energy and security relations with Russia. It's a very different kind of integration. What about the Middle East? If the international community is going to play less a role in the Middle East, what drives integration in the Middle East? Well, I mean, the most important countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran, all support completely different proxy players across that region. The Saudis supporting Sunni Arab monarchies and militaries, largely the status quo. The Iranians supporting Shia disenfranchised populations in these countries. The Turkeys closer to the Saudis, the Turks, but still, to the extent they support anyone, more secularized urban middle classes. If those are the countries that are going to do most of the driving, then we're not driving integration, we're driving fragmentation. Sectarianism becomes the most important issue to look to see where cleavages will be and where integration will be in the Middle East. That's really important. It doesn't bode well for the Middle East and the G0 and beyond. And then in Asia, if you are focused on economics, you are integrating towards China. But if you're focused on security, you're integrating towards the United States. For how long is that sustainable? And you have to ask yourself, will the United States continue to provide that level of guarantee, especially if they don't feel that they're benefiting sufficiently from it economically? And perhaps more importantly, will the Chinese permit these countries to maintain that level of balance or hedge or pivot as the Chinese develop much stronger economic relations and influence and therefore political influence? For some countries, the answer will still be yes, Singapore, for example. For other countries, the answer will be much more challenging over time. And so that's sort of the way that I unpack a little bit of the G0 world and where we're going. Again, I think it's an interesting model to play with. It's certainly gotten a lot of people to talk, which I enjoy. Again, I really appreciate how many of you have come out on a rainy night tonight here in London. I'm sure your entertainment options are manifold, and I suspect many of you will be getting to them after this is over. But for now, I'm glad you're here with me, and I'm looking forward to a really sort of lively discussion with everybody. Thank you very much.